Hey y'all, my name's Melissa. I am the blogger at Melly Sews, and I design blank slate patterns. I'm also the author of the book Sundressing, and today we are going to be sewing one of the patterns from my shop. This is the Pocket Full of Posies dress. This is a knit dress with really deep pockets. That's where it gets the name. And we're going to be talking about a few details today on it. The pleating on the neckline we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about how these pockets are constructed, and I'll show you how to do that. And then we'll be talking about a few different options for the neckband, the armbands, and the hemband of the dress. Two different ways to put those on. So I'm looking forward to sewing with you, and I hope you'll have fun sewing with me today. The first step to this pattern is the neckline and the pleating. So I've got a sample here. This is the center front piece of the pattern, and I've got the pleats and the center front marked out on it. This is marked on the right side of the pattern, so I've made sure to use a marking tool that will disappear. This is a friction pen actually, so it'll disappear once it's ironed. You always want to make sure to test whatever marking tool you're going to use on your fabric to make sure it washes out, especially when you're marking on the front side, as I am. And in case you're not sure about the difference between the right and the wrong side of knit fabric, particularly when it's the same color on each side, the back side of knit fabric, the threads, if you look really closely, and it's possibly easier to see when it's stretched, the threads run horizontally on the back side. On the front side, you can see columns running up and down, and that's how you can tell the right and the wrong side. Another clue on these is that when you have knit fabric, it tends to curl towards the right side on the perpendicular to the stretch. This stretches this way mostly, and it tends to curl towards the wrong side with the stretch. So you can see the edges here curl. So let's go ahead and we're going to fold and stitch the pleats for the center front here. I'm going to grab the first pleat mark, and there are arrows on the pattern that show you, but the direction of the arrow is to pleat it towards center. So I'm going to fold the fabric and match that pleat mark with the center front, and then I'm going to pin. And I'll do the same thing with the next pleat from the edge. We'll fold right along the mark. I'm just kind of pinching the fabric up. And this pleat ends up right against the first pleat that you made. We just repeat, folding towards center on the opposite side. And you want to take a second to make sure that your pleats in the center are right on that center mark and that they are right next to each other. You wouldn't want space in the center front. You want them right next to each other. And then the last. So you can see how much narrower this piece gets once the pleats are added in. Once you've got those pinned in place, and you may want to add a couple more pins to feel secure, you're going to take this over to the machine and you're going to stitch this. You want to stitch not in the seam allowance right next to the edge of the fabric, and you want to use a basting stitch. That means that you're going to want to increase the stitch length to pretty much the longest one that your machine will let you do. And even though this is knit fabric, I'm sewing this part with a running stitch. Later, when the stretch is important, we will be switching to a zigzag stitch, or you would want to use a serger so that the stitching will stretch with the fabric. But here, we don't actually want stretch. So once I've stitched, it will look like that, and you can remove the pins. Now this stitching is just to hold this in place until we apply the neckline, which is one of the last steps. The next step after doing the neckline pleating, and here we've got, this piece is right side up. And you can see I've got the stitching here where we've put the pleats in. And then we're actually going to be constructing the pocket facing and pocket, which lay out towards this side. You can see how those neckline edges end up matching up right here. So to do this, the first piece you need is the pocket facing piece. Now, this has fusible interfacing on the back. This is knit interfacing, which does stretch widthwise, but it doesn't stretch lengthwise. That's important because we don't want these pockets stretching in the dress, otherwise you'd end up by the end of the day with pockets down at your knees that you couldn't reach. So the interfacing is not a step that you can skip on this one. It stabilizes the fabric and keeps it from stretching anymore. To sew this non-stretch fabric to the stretchy knit of the dress front, there are a couple of tricks. I'm pinning these right sides together, and then I'm going to want to make sure that when I sew this, that the stretchy side is against the feed dogs on the machine. That will help make sure that this feeds without puckering. If you put the stretchy knit on the right side, when you're stitching, the presser foot can start creating wrinkles, particularly near the pins. So I'm just pinning this pocket facing to the pocket. And then we are going to stitch this. Now again, since this part is not meant to stretch, I'm sticking with that straight stitch. And I'm sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance because that is what the pattern calls for. As you stitch, it's still a good idea to make sure that the knit fabric on the underside is flat before you stitch over it. It's really hard once you get a wrinkle in the knit fabric to unwrinkle it and unpucker it. So this is what the pocket facing looks like when it is stitched on. And we're going to want to clip in the curve here to make sure that when we flip this over that it is able to lie flat. So you're going to need your scissors to do that. And all you want to do is where the curve starts, you want to clip all the way up to but not through your stitching line. You'll remove a little triangle of fabric. And you want to do a few of these all along that curve. So once those are clipped out, that will allow the pocket facing to get pressed to the inside of the dress. And at this point, you would want to go ahead and press this with an iron, and you can also optionally top stitch if you like the look of top stitching and you want to keep it from rolling. There is actually top stitching on this sample dress, so that is a suggested step, but it's definitely not required. And then up here at the neckline, we also want to trim off those corners even with the neckline. So it'll look like that. So once you've finished the pocket facing, you're going to put the pocket on. So the pocket facing actually folds back towards the dress, and you can see again, here's how the neckline matches up. And then we are going to lay the pocket piece right sides together with the pocket facing, and that'll finish creating the front of the dress. So the curve at the bottom of the pocket and pocket facing, those match up, and then it's just going to match up all along this seam. So we would pin and stitch right along here. I'm going to show you what that looks like on the other side though that is already stitched. So we've got the pocket facing folds back towards the neckline. And then you can now see this is the armhole and the side seam of the dress here. And this is the whole pocket construction. If we flip that carefully to the front side, what you'll want to do is you'll want to pin the neckline together. You may even want to baste this together so that it doesn't unfold itself. And make sure that this facing and the center front piece and the side front pieces are all laying flat together. So you could do a basting stitch there to hold them, but that is then going to be where the neckband gets applied and holds everything else together. Similarly, on the side here, you want to make sure that the pocket facing, and the center front of the dress all lay flat together down this side seam. Because when you attach the back of the dress, all of this is going to get sewn in one long seam. So you'd want to pin or baste this as well. When you've finished with that step, you'll have the inside of the dress will look more like this. Now this is one I've already added the neckline to, and I've sewn down the side seams, and you can see here are the pockets here. I've used a serger and a cover stitch machine to finish off this one, but I'm going to show you how to do this on a regular machine as well. So the neck band and the hem band and the sleeve bands are all applied in a similar manner, and I'm going to show you two methods to do that. You can pick your preference on that. To start with, you want to take your hem, your sleeve, your neckband, whichever band that you've got, and you want to fold it in half and sew these short edges together. Now, these are going to end up getting folded in half this way too when they get applied. So a neat trick is if you clip into your stitching, just to your stitching line, when you fold, if you put one seam allowance each way, that will give you a much flatter seam, which will be less bothersome to sew through, and it won't be as bad to wear either. You wouldn't have like a big bulky part of the hem. So two methods to attach these. I've got one of the sleeves here, and I've gone ahead and I've sewn the sleeve seam. Let me turn this right side or inside out so you can see. I've sewn the sleeve seam. Now typically this would all get done as part of the side seam, but I've done it a little out of order for this dress because that way it's easier to have a small piece of fabric and show you how to apply these bands. So the sleeve seam is sewn. The sleeve would be right side out. And the first method for attaching this here would be to take the sleeve band, match up the sleeve seam with the band seam, and then just go ahead and pin all around. I'm putting 2 pins here to hold those seam allowances down. Now you'll notice that the band is very slightly smaller than the sleeve, so we just want to gently stretch it just enough so that the band and the seam are the same size. That's also why I'm using rib knit here, because it has more stretch and recovery than typical jersey knit like I've used for the rest of the dress. And what that does is make sure that the band doesn't hang too loose around your arm. And it also, on the hem of the dress, draws the dress in a little towards the bottom to give it the shape. So I've stretched just enough to get it to lay flat with the fabric, no more. And I only do about 4 pins when I'm doing this because that allows me to stretch in between on the sewing machine. To stitch this on, we're going to switch to a zigzag stitch here because it is important that the seam here stretches. So I'm going to switch my machine to a zigzag stitch, and that way the stitch can stretch. I'm going to do a fairly long length stitch. So I've got this set to about a 3 millimeter long stitch and about a 2 millimeter wide stitch. And we don't want to be sewing over pins. I like to, especially with sleeves, I like to place the needle inside the loop that I'm sewing. That way you don't have to worry about things bunching up on the back side. Okay, so once I've got that stitched in, I want to fold the top half of my seam allowance the opposite direction, and I'm going to kind of hold that with my hand while I turn the whole sleeve wrong side out. And then we want this seam that we just sewed, we want that to go down towards the band, and then we'll pin just over that seam allowance. So what this does is this covers up any raw edges that would be from the seam inside your sleeve or inside your hemband or inside your neckband, and it lets everything lay a lot flatter. We don't have to finish the seam in the same way that we would a woven fabric because woven fabric frays and knit fabric is not going to unravel in the same way. So it is okay to leave this raw edge without stitching it because it's not going to fray. However, it's nice to get it over that seam line and get all of that seam allowance inside and make it nice and flat. Particularly if you have sensitivities to fabric or if you're sewing for somebody with a lot of fabric sensitivity, you know, the type of people who like tagless clothing, then this is a good method to make sure that this is not irritating to anyone. So once this is pinned, and again, I'm stretching just very slightly just to get the band to lay flat with the sleeve. And it's just barely covering the seam, the stitching line from before. What I'm going to do is I'm going to place this back in the machine, and then I'm going to get the needle so that part of the zigzag lands to the right side on the sleeve band, and part of the zigzag lands to the left side on the sleeve itself. That's going to secure this in place so that we don't have any sleeve band rolling out. So once that step is done, you can see on the right side of the sleeve how that's just holding the seam band nice and flat and in place, and on the wrong side of the seam how that's just against the edge, and again it's nice and flat and in place. So that's one method to sew on the sleeves, the neckband, and the hemband. You can do that to make sure that you don't have any raw edges inside or out. Now, if the raw edges don't bother you as much and you're in a hurry, there's another thing you can do. So I'm going to start with a sleeve band here, and I'm going to clip the seam allowances again. And then, before attaching it, I'm going to go ahead, going to fold the whole thing so that I've got a roll, and then I'm going to place that right sides together over the sleeve, which is also right side out. I'll match the seam allowances. And then I'm going to match all 3 raw edges around the edge of the sleeve. And just like before, I'm stretching this to make sure that the hemband matches the sleeve. So with this method, again, I'm going to use a zigzag stitch. You could also, of course, use a serger. And I'm only going to be stitching once this time around the sleeve because I'm catching all 3 layers in it. So when you attach one of the bands using this method, you end up with, on the outside, it's going to look pretty similar, except for it won't have the stitching line. On the inside, however, you are going to have those raw edges. Now, because it is a knit fabric, you don't have to worry about them unraveling. However, that's just not as neat and tidy on the inside as the first method. So this one I feel is okay to do on sleeves and even on the bottom hemband. These are thick enough that it won't necessarily roll out, but this is not the method I would recommend for the neckline because that extra fabric tends to try to roll out. Now you can, if you really want, you could also do this method and you could top stitch that right up here to get that seam to keep it from rolling out, but then you're gonna have stitching like well away from the seam line. It would be up here. So this is kind of the quickie cheater method. If you're in a hurry, this is the way to go. But if you want a nice finish for something you're going to be wearing over and over, I think the first method, which is the one outlined in the pattern, is the better way to go. So the last step with these would be to attach them to this dress. And again, I've gone out of order from how the pattern is because with the pattern you attach the sleeves first flat and then the sleeve bands last. But since I went out of order to demonstrate the bands on a smaller amount of fabric, I'm going to show you how you would put these sleeves in if you had done it this way. And you're going to want to put the sleeve right side out. It's inside the armhole of the wrong side out dress. And you would match these seams. And then the rest of the sleeve falls into place around that armhole. The top of the sleeve, the highest part of the cap, should match the shoulder seam. And then the sleeve fullness in between. And then I would sew this just like I did with the sleeve band by placing this on the machine and sewing it around with the needle on the inside. I do want to address a couple more tips on this before we stop. You might notice that on this one I've got twill tape sewn into the shoulder seam, and on the side seams I've used, this is knit interfacing as well. The reason I did that is this particular fabric has a lot of four-way stretch, so it stretches vertically as well as horizontally quite a bit. And you don't want those side seams to stretch out. Those are giving support to the garment, and you don't want the shoulder seams to stretch out because, again, that's supporting the garment on your body. So if you are working with a fabric that's a lot of vertical stretch as well as the horizontal stretch that you need, it's a good idea to go ahead and add some twill tape or fusible interfacing to those shoulder and side seams just to help support everything, particularly the hemband because that can get a little bit heavy. So, right side out, once the sleeve is set in, that's approximately how this dress would look. So I've got the finished piece right here, of course, and we went over how to do this pleating on the neckline, how to face these pockets and then sew the pocket pieces on, and then how to sew the hembands on the neckline, the arms, and the hem. We've got two methods for those, and as I said, I recommend doing the longer one on the neckband and then whichever you prefer on the sleeve and hembands. And that is the Pocket Full of Posies dress. Thank you for joining me today. I've really enjoyed sewing with you. I hope you've enjoyed sewing with me.